Hello, everybody, and welcome into another episode of the Couch GMs podcast. It is Wednesday, July 27th, 2022, and I'm your host, George Kerth, joined by Cody Roadcap. Cody, did you smell that in the air? It's the smell of like the most wonderful time of the year.
It does, George. Football is officially back. By the time this podcast is released, all teams will be in training camp. Some have already hit the field. Some's first day will be today. It is great to see football back in action. It's great to see football on the Twitter timeline. Just so excited getting all my words all mixed up, but I'm happy to have football back. It feels like forever. Like as a Packers fan, I was thinking about how it seems forever ago we were talking about, is Aaron Rodgers retiring? Like, think about those conversations we were having, how long that feels ago. We're at now. We're talking about the 2022 season, which team is going to be the best and which fantasy players are going to be the best.
Exactly. Like, there's no more speculation. Well, there's still some speculation because we're going to talk about how guys are going to do in practice and all, but we're actually getting to see guys on the field, sometimes in pads. We're getting close to the preseason. Everything is ramping up here at the Couch GMs and in the NFL. And today on the show, we're going to hit a lot of news and notes that are coming out at the beginning of training camps as people start to hit the physically unable to perform list or have their first media sessions of the season. We're going to hit a little good old fantasy debate that's coming out of the fantasy mailbag. We had a friend send in a question to us. We're going to talk about it, and we're going to give our training camp preview as every team starts off their training camps. We're going to hit a little top 5 position battles across the league, and we're going to talk about some players on a budget. I'm just going to leave it there. We're going to talk about it later in the show. You have to hang around to find out. Make sure you find us on thecouchgms.com and our social media channels. We are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok at the Couch GMs. Cody, that was a mouthful. I thought it was a long intro. We're going to jump into NFL news. Starting off NFL news with a little bit of what happened at the end of last week, and that was Kyler Murray, quarterback for the Arizona Cardinals, got paid. He got the second highest average per year value of a quarterback in the NFL in his 5-year, $230.5 million extension. $160 million of that guaranteed. I get it that he is a young up-and-coming quarterback, but second in average per year for quarterbacks in the league seems like a lot based off of potential. Like Kyler Murray hasn't won anything yet.
I mean, he hasn't won anything, but they drafted him number 1 overall. He's been productive. Like, when you take a quarterback number 1 overall, this is the kind of contract you want to give them. He comes in number 2 in average per year, right behind Aaron Rodgers, who is sitting about 50. He's right ahead Deshaun Watson. And I think if you compare him to Deshaun Watson's contract is fully guaranteed. We're talking strictly contracts is what we're comparing right now.
Okay.
His contract, Deshaun's, is fully guaranteed, where Kyler Murray's is only $160 million. So there's still $70 million of unguaranteed money on this contract. Who knows if he'll see it all? And then part of that guarantee, there is a mandatory 4-hour independent study clause per week. Very interesting. It's one of those things that I'm still not 100% sure if like this is like in a lot of contracts and it just hasn't come out, or if this is something specific to Kyler Murray. How is it going to be monitored? Is it just like, hey, you're going to watch 4 hours of film a week, and like most NFL players do that? So I feel like it's a bigger story. But what are your thoughts on this, potential clause in his contract that could cost him up to $100 million?
This feels to me like a media play because we were talking about how like there was character concerns with Kyler Murray after last year's playoffs and everything else. So like people are going to see a clause that, like you said, might be in everyone else's contract. We're really not sure. And they're going to blow it up and make it like, oh, this could be a good storyline. So I really am not too concerned about it. And if he wasn't somebody who was watching 4 hours of film on his own time during the season, then I'm kind of glad he's going to start. I think that's only going to help him as a player. But I think the best quote out of the whole thing that I heard was somebody spun it towards another player and said, back when Peyton Manning was playing, they wish that there was he has to spend 4 hours not watching film per week.
That'd be interesting, trying to, give players, a chance to breathe. I know we're a football podcast, but unfortunately, I'm also a fan of basketball, and I'm a fan of the Detroit Pistons, who did just drop some new teal jerseys, which look legit rebranded from a jersey. But I digress. That's not the point of this. But they had to tell one of their young rising stars, like, take a break this summer. Like, they literally had to go to him and say, you need to stop playing basketball. You need to find another hobby because you're spending too much time basketball. You need to give yourself a little bit of break. So some players are like that across all sports. Some players, they show up, they do their job, they go home, and it works for everybody. And don't get it twisted. We're not saying like this is a knock on Kyler Murray. He's still been a solid quarterback. He's still going to be a solid fantasy option. Um, it'll be interesting. We can have this debate a little bit later in the show or next week or as we get closer. But him versus Jalen Hurts, I think they're very similar in their fantasy production this year. So that's going to be a fun one.
Hmm.
I think Kyler Murray's better on the field in terms of actual football, but we'll see how the fantasy community thinks of that one for a later time. George, the big news, though,
Hmm.
if it's even big news, former All Pro wide receiver Julio Jones, we've been wondering where he's going to end up all offseason, finally finds a new home. And of course, it's with Tom Brady.
I can't say I'm shocked. Especially like we're not exactly sure what's left in the tank for Julio Jones. Like he looked good at times last year. He was injured a lot last year. He didn't really play too much with the Titans. But he was like a shell of himself most of the time last year. So there's a chance he comes in and isn't really even used that much. But this makes an interesting camp battle that we're not actually going to talk about later. But I want to bring up Julio Jones versus Russell Gage because everyone seemed to be jumping on the late round flyer, Russell Gage. He's going to be a wide receiver too until Chris Godwin comes back, and then he has a chance to fill the Antonio Brown role. Julio Jones might be the Antonio Brown in that offense now. I mean, we don't know what he has left, like I said, but it's a big name. And I think a big reason why he went to Tampa Bay with Tom Brady is he's trying to chase a ring before he retires, but that's not shocking.
Yeah, I think there is some ring chasing here. It will be interesting on fantasy. We can discuss it real quick. But first, how many games do you think Julio played in last year? Because when I find out, I actually thought it was more than I thought.
It's more than you thought. Well, that makes me okay. So originally I was going to say 8, but you're making me stray towards 12.
Okay, so it was 10. Like I was thinking
Okay.
it was like 6, and maybe that's just because like co-host Snyder, who's not with us tonight, always complained that he was never playing, but he still
Yeah.
played in 10 games. You know, he was pretty efficient when he was able to play. He got robbed of a touchdown. If you're a Titans fan, it was the correct call. If you're not a Titans fan, um, but in terms of what he brings to Tampa Bay, I was thinking of this. He might be more of not for the inline work of the tight end, but all the stuff that Rob Gronkowski did when he was split outside or
Hmm.
bounced out to the slot gives him a big bodied, another big body. Chris Godwin also got some positive news. He's not starting on PUP this year, despite tearing his ACL in January, which is mind blowing that he is going to be at least ready for training camp. Now they're going to be cautious with him, so I'd still temper your expectations for him to be a full go the first month of the season. But Russell Gage, like a guy that we thought could be a real potential person, like he's dropped significantly with the news of Chris Godwin and Julio Jones. Don't expect like prime Julio Jones, but it could be a solid option that takes a little bit of what we missed with Rob Gronkowski. They also added
Hmm.
Kyle Rudolph this past week too, so Tampa Bay is trying to add some pieces to build around Tom Brady for one final run.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm sure we'll talk more about that wide receiver room and even tight end room as we get closer to the season. So I think we can leave it there, move on to some running back news. Chris Carson, who we have been waiting on a status update for a while with his neck injury, is officially, in quotes, retiring. So he's not making an official retirement announcement in case his neck does happen to heal over this season and he wants to come back for a run next year. But it is not expected now by doctors that he will get back to NFL shape. So he is leaving the Seattle Seahawks, not expected to play any more NFL football. So we'll talk a little bit more about the Seahawks backfield later in the show, but good run for Chris Carson. And it's really sad to see him go the way he has at the end of his career.
Yeah, neck injuries are always tough when you see them come from, you know, any position, especially in the NFL. Chris Carson, former seventh round pick, he's still only 27 years old, so it's really hard to see a guy that made his way into a starting caliber running back, looked promising, very productive, even for fantasy for a few years. Did deal a little bit with fumble issues, but a solid guy that, you loved having Chris Carson as your RB2 before the neck injury. Still being 27, so maybe he will be able to bounce back, but we've seen it with multiple players that neck injuries are very hard to come back from. And whether he comes back in the NFL or not, I know myself, George, Tyler, Couch GMs, if Chris Carson were happen to hear this, congrats on a really incredible career. And we're definitely rooting for you to come back. But if you aren't able to make it back due to the unfortunate circumstances, like, best of luck in whatever you end up doing in the rest of your life. If you get into football in a different way, you move on to bigger and better things. Best of luck.
Couldn't have said it better myself, Cody, but I do have one more quick Chris Carson question. That was actually harder to say than I thought. Before we move on, dynasty formats.
Like me.
Yeah, right? In dynasty formats, a lot of times if a player's on a contract and they retire, you can drop them for free off their roster. But he didn't make an official retirement announcement, despite a lot of people saying he is retiring in that word. Do you think that this counts as a retirement, that they should be able to get a free cut off the roster but retain his rights? Or is this another one of those where a player basically goes unsigned and has to stay on your roster or get cut for a penalty?
So I think you can use this for the free retirement cut.
Okay.
But even if you, in my opinion, if you use the retirement cut, you lose the rights. Like, if you have, like, let's take Rob Gronkowski, for example. If you want to hold on to Rob Gronkowski until the middle of the season or next year to see if he potentially comes back, then you have to hold on to him. But if you say he retired and you cut him to get out of a contract, if you're in a more sophisticated, or that's a terrible word for it, but a more in-depth dynasty league where you actually have a salary cap and you have to manage budgets and stuff like that, then I think if you cut them, you get the cap relief, but you lose out the rights. That's how I would handle it if I was a commissioner of a dynasty league. If there isn't, any cap, if it's more of like a 15-team keeper league than a true dynasty, or 15-player instead of a true dynasty, then maybe you can just stash them on your IR or something like that. Let the commissioner move them there. But other than that, I do think it's the end of Chris Carson. So even if you're out there debating this, I think you'd be pretty confident in cutting him.
Well said. We can move on then to some TV news, and I'll give my little say here before I hand it over to Cody. The NFL is getting into the streaming game. They've announced NFL Plus, which is basically a new version of NFL Game Pass, if anyone has had that in the past. But there's 2 tiers to NFL Plus. You can pay $4.99 a month and get all the preseason games live. I'm not sure if you can also get them on demand, but you can get them live. And then $9.99 a month is all the preseason games, plus all the features are formally known in NFL Game Pass. I have a feeling that this, especially the live part, is a test run to see if the NFL wants to move Sunday Ticket to their own platform. Is that even something that passed through your mind when you heard this?
For sure. I mean, I've been saying it for the last couple of years, when we're hearing, Apple TV Plus, Amazon Plus. Like, why isn't the NFL just making its own? Every company has their own streaming service. Like, why hasn't the NFL do it? And maybe it's because they don't have. I mean, they have certain content that you can get all year round, but they're not creating content in February, for NFL Plus. So I think that might be the only holdback, is you get the NFL games, but what keeps a subscriber all year long? That's what they're going to have to look. Maybe they take, all or nothing for something, again, stealing it from Amazon, but do that and then release it post Super Bowl to give some filler. Something like, it'd be interesting how this grows, but $4.99 for all the preseason games live is a pretty incredible value. Like, I know I used to try to find as many email accounts to get the free week of NFL Game Pass just so I could watch the Packers preseason game. And then in that $4.99, it also includes the radio broadcast of all the games. So even if you can't watch it, you can at least listen to your favorite team. So I do like what the NFL is going. It did cross my mind if they might potentially do this themselves. Obviously, I feel like it would go up from $9.99 the premium if you started getting all the games. That would probably be premium plus, add another tier, platinum, whatever you want to call it. But definitely could be some big things coming from the NFL. I just hope. I'm not sure how much familiar you are with Game Pass, but Game Pass last year was an absolute joke. and that's why they're not a sponsor. I mean, I'd love it if they were, but Game Pass was a joke last year. The interface was terrible. So I do think people coming from Game Pass, NFL Plus is going to have to re-get some people back and show, hey, we actually updated our integration to our website. We upgraded how it flows, how it works. And hopefully they do that. And it's not like, the video game company that they let make video games about them that just puts out the same garbage every year.
It's in the game, Cody. It's in the game. But no, I think that if they do go to their own thing, it probably wouldn't be a monthly thing. It would probably be you can put it into payments similar to the way they do Sunday Ticket now, but it's like you pay per season. You might also get access to all that NFL network content that they do in the off seasons, like the recaps of old Super Bowls and that kind of thing. So you might get like that on demand as well in that kind of a package. But
I
who
think
knows?
you do get that with the 99 subscription now. You get like
Okay.
old games, the archives,
Mhm.
all the old tapings of Football Life, like there's all that content. It was just more of what new content can they produce for the slower
Mhm.
times to keep somebody paying, you know, and not have that thing where everybody subscribes in September, dips in February or January
Yeah.
when the playoffs start and all the games are televised. And two, I think there will be some issues in that aspect of it too, with the local blackouts and stuff like that. They'll have to work out with the TV companies to avoid any issues with those TV deals. But there was a report that they weren't getting as much interest in this, Sunday Ticket replacement as they thought they would have.
Hmm.
Um, so this could be another leeway into it. But that's probably enough talking about how we're going to watch the games, and we should probably talk about who's going to be playing in the games. And so we have some injury updates as training camp is kicking off. Now, remember, we're going to talk about a bunch of players that are put on PUP and the non-football uh, injury list. Just a quick difference: PUP is physically unable to perform. Non-football injury is like if a player got hurt outside of the facility or training on his own, um, or like fell off his bike and hurt his wrist. He's not quite ready to go. Then he'd be on NFI. So PUP, if you last on PUP all training camping or placed there at the start of the season, you won't count towards the 53. As of this year, it's only 4 weeks off compared to 6. But once you come off PUP, you can't go back on PUP. You'd have to be put on IR after cut down day to come back in the NFL season. Um, so we'll start off with the big one, and I'll get your instant reaction on this. James Robinson, despite tearing his Achilles last year, will not start on PUP. I have to ask, after him, Cam Akers coming back in record time, is the Achilles starting to become how the ACL is now for some players, where it's not a full year, it's a 10-month recovery.
Man, but Cam Akers was 6 months. Like that was absolutely ridiculous. But no, I think it is becoming a lot more like the ACL. Like there was a lot of times back, even I want to say like 6 years ago, 7 years ago, maybe, that we were like the ACL, you can come back the next season, but you're not 100%. And then once Adrian Peterson came back from his ACL and ran for 2,000 yards that year, the entire scope changed. So maybe Cam Akers and James Robinson are the change for the Achilles, but I don't want to say I told you so, but James Robinson is higher in my rankings than Travis Etienne. And now we're looking at James Robinson probably being ready to start the season. Maybe
I'm
I'm
still taking.
right.
I'm still having. Even if Robinsons go, ETN is still higher for me. Even if he wasn't coming off an Achilles injury, I'd still have ETN higher. I know that sounds crazy, but I just think with the new head coaching staff, what a first round pick, what they have in Travis Etienne, who is also coming off of his own injury too. So let's not
That's
forget
true
that.
too.
Um, I just like his upside, and there. So I'm going to go with the upside player, but I do think James Robinson could steal some snaps quicker than we initially expected. Staying with running backs, though, the Baltimore Ravens, they had J.K. Dobbins and Gus Edwards start on the PUP. Harbaugh said it appears Edwards is questionable for the season opener, and he is probably more ahead than J.K. Dobbins, which this is why you
Hmm.
have to take every injury into consideration, or it's a different injury because J.K. Dobbins tore his ACL. We're just talking about how fast players are coming back. Sometimes there's more damage than just a traditional ACL. Sometimes it takes longer. Um, they still expect J.K. Dobbins to be back this year. They expect him to be back full to himself, but it's not looking great for him. He looks like a candidate to start the season on PUP. but they did sign Corey Clement, former Eagles running back, to help offset some of these running back injuries as camp is starting.
Mike Davis is also on that roster too, so we're going to be keeping an eye on that backfield going into the season. Like J.K. Dobbins is probably going to be a really good stash year IR and hold, because he's going to be the lead back, I feel like, when he comes back. But is it going to be Gus Edwards to start the season, Mike Davis, Corey Clement? I don't even know. There's probably still a couple other backs from last year still on that roster. We are going to have to wait and find out. So they're way up in the air. I'll stick with a little bit more running back. Clyde Edwards-Helaire of the Kansas City Chiefs also was put on the physically unable to perform list. So that's right now currently Ronald Jones's backfield, but we don't know how that's going to shake out afterwards. And then we also had a bunch of Packers news where Robert Tonyan, Mason Crosby, David Bakhtiari, and Christian Watson are all starting on the physically unable to perform list, and Sammy Watkins is on the non-football injury list. That's a lot of players.
Yeah, one of the most injured teams last year is starting the season off right. Christian Watson is, one of the guys that isn't supposed to be serious. No updates on what the NFI for Sammy Watkins is. Robert Tonyan's still goal is to start week 1. We'll have to see whether that comes to fruition. But the big one is David Bakhtiari, because he tore his ACL in the 2020 playoffs.
Yep.
He didn't play until week 17 of last year, or week 18, I guess it is, because 17-week season. Week 18 of against the Detroit Lions, he played 24 snaps, and he's just had a lot of issues with fluid buildup and stuff like that. So hopefully, as we'll get some more information coming out on him, but the offensive line is going to be a big part of the Packers trying to keep him protected, and that's one of the best left tackles in the game. So definitely something to watch and how you evaluate Aaron Jones and some of these other guys moving forward. So that's a key piece. That's why he's on this list, even though he's not a true fantasy player. Sticking with some guys on PUP at the wide receiver position, we have Jamison Williams, the Lions rookie wide receiver. No surprise here that he hits PUP. Hollywood Brown hits the non-football injury list. Justin Ross, undrafted free agent for the Kansas City Chiefs, which ironically, sidebar, George and I are in a dynasty league that just finished up their rookie draft. It was an offline rookie draft that took a couple weeks. Justin Ross got drafted higher in our rookie draft than Tyquan Thornton, who was the second round pick for the Patriots, who went undrafted. Yet Justin Ross, undrafted free agent, got drafted, but he's done for the season. He had a foot surgery. He was placed on IR, and being placed on IR during training camp means you're out for the whole season. You don't get the 4-week. You have to make the initial 53. Then the big story that came out on Tuesday, Jimmy G.
You just totally skipped over Michael Thomas.
Did I skip over Michael Thomas? I'm sorry.
Skipped over Michael Thomas.
Another one very similar to like a David Bakhtiari, very much like we have so much unknown because he hasn't played for so while, and we'll have to wait even longer to see him on the field. But what I was getting to was Jimmy G of the San Francisco 49ers is doing well. He should start throwing here soon. But Kyle Shan said on Tuesday, this is Trey's team. And he doesn't expect Jimmy G to practice with the 49ers. They're going to try to facilitate a trade to where he wants to go. So it pretty much seems like Jimmy G is done. So one, they're not getting any trade value out of him after these comments. And honestly, if I'm Jimmy G, I'm like, I want to go to the Seahawks in division. And they're pretty much one of the only teams left that could still have a debate at quarterback. And they might give him a 6th-round pick for Jimmy G, which is crazy value. But we'll have to wait and see. George, any thoughts on this? I know you were a guy that still thought Jimmy G had a chance to start, or any other teams you might think that Jimmy G could end up.
I mean, this is where all that offseason speculation starts to get put into perspective here. So between the news last week of them being ready to facilitate a trade and now this comment that's saying it's Trey Lance's team, I don't think there's any chance that Jimmy Garoppolo starts. We just got to hope Trey Lance takes that step to make the 49ers offense as good as it was last year. When it comes to where Jimmy G is going to get traded to, I think I'm sticking with my guns and saying Seattle's the best option, just like you said. But it's going to be very hard for them to trade in division. Like, I feel like you might take a little extra, like move that draft pick up 1 round or something, just because they don't want to come back and get burned by Garoppolo. But I have a better feeling that the team he's going to go to, we don't know yet. I feel like it's going to be an injury in the preseason. It even could leak into the season, and a team that looks like it's contender has a big quarterback injury. I think it's still going to be one of those, and you can't really predict where that's going to hit, but I think the most logical place for him is somewhere that is in the deep unknown.
Interesting take. I'm going to give you one other team name before we move on and get out of all these injury updates. And this is completely dependent on what finally happens with Deshaun Watson. And depending on how long the suspension is, the hearing's done. We've heard that the NFLPA would sue the NFL if it's a full season, et cetera, et cetera. But we still don't know what the rulings are. But when you know you can get him cheap, how you don't make that call, even if he's going to miss 8 weeks, how you don't make that call for, I know the contract and making the money work would be tough, but how you don't make that call, because Jimmy G, say what you want, he is an upgrade over Jacoby Brissett, over Josh Rosen, who they just recently signed. Like, there is potential for the Cleveland Browns to, make a late push for Jimmy G because of it's not going to cost a lot to get him.
I was taking a drink as you started saying that line. I literally almost spit out my Coke because I was like, there's no way that they go out there and trade for another quarterback this offseason. But I guess it makes sense because they should be a contender this year. He would be their best chance of contending because everyone else is gone. But I mean, keeping Baker probably would have been the next best option, and they couldn't do that with that fractured relationship. But I don't see how they can make the contract work is the big thing. But really from a like purely what you need to do to win standpoint, Garoppolo makes sense. But for Garoppolo's standpoint, I kind of hope he gets to go to a team where he can start long term. I still think he deserves that. Maybe I'm alone in that. But the man just wins games. He's not a fantastic quarterback, but like pair him up with like a Kirk Cousins. They're not fantastic, but they win. And if you put a good enough team around them, they could have a chance to push for a championship.
Yeah, and my only rebuttal to that is I do think he gets, he'll have a bad game here or there like Kirk Cousins, but they're solid guys. And Kirk Cousins is actually a decent quarterback, as much as that hurts me to say it. But I do think, Cleveland would be a good stopgap because he's a free agent next year. And that is a good team around him. They have the offensive line. They've added weapons. They have the running back duo. They have a solid defense. Like, that could be, a fun 1-year stopgap into him becoming, a hot free agent candidate next year as he bounces back. And would definitely help his market compared to being stuck as a backup waiting for the 49ers to trade him in the next coming weeks. But George, that is definitely enough injury news talk. We got a lot of other stuff to hit. So why don't we get into a good old fantasy debate?
All right, Cody, we're dipping into the fantasy mailbag this week, and we had a question come into our inbox on Facebook, and it asked, what is the best fantasy football platform? So this listener, he only had really ever used Yahoo and ESPN. And I will say ESPN, not a fan. I know Tyler is not either. I do not think Cody is either. Yahoo is not bad, but it's not my favorite. So I guess I'll kick it off. And my favorite platform, even though it might be a little bit limiting, depending on what kind of league you're going for, is still NFL.com. I think I like the ease of use of it. It's nice that they have good news integration as well because, being affiliated with the NFL, they get all of those NFL insider news going straight into the player news on the actual app. And they are very quick with switching players to injured reserve, activating them, showing their status on game day if they're out or in. So I like that it makes it easy. You don't have to go digging for news or anything like that. You have everything right in front of you. And I like the history feature as well. Like, this is the platform we use for our league of record. And it's nice to be able to go back 10 years and say, oh, you remember that playoff game where Tyler beat me 156 to 153? I think that's what he would have said if he was on here. So that's why I had to mention it. But so that's my NFL.com is my favorite. What do you got, Cody?
Alrighty. So I think, one, just to clarify, if you're out there listening, we're talking about the 4 big platforms, which are NFL.com, Sleeper, Yahoo, and ESPN. I think CBS still has a platform. I think there's some other ones. Fantrax, I think, is an up and coming one. There's a lot of other platforms out there, but we're
My
mainly
fantasy
debating
league.
My Fantasy League. That's a completely different style of fantasy. And I think we're talking the main way people play, which is the redraft, occasionally your keepers. I'm with you guys. ESPN is definitely at the bottom. It is my least
Hmm.
favorite. They tried to do too much. Like they tried to make like a fantasy home that you would like run all your fantasy teams for, and then just using it for fantasy football and not having a basketball, baseball, NASCAR, like all those other fantasy, just too complicated. Um, for me, my favorite, even though it's the one that I only have, I think, 2 leagues on, but the one that works for me, I'm a huge fan of Sleeper. I know it's a little bit of a learning curve. Not a learning curve. It's just not as set up the way the other three. The other three seem to like try to copy each other, and Sleeper try to do
Hmm.
something different. What I like about Sleeper is you can do one app, you can do Dynasty, you can do Keeper, you can do Standard. What I love is how quick you can jump into a mock draft. I know Colin, who reached out to us, one of the part he was talking about is draft boards. And I think Sleeper does the best job at showing the full draft board. NFL has come on, like that's a feature they've started to add better, but Sleeper has done it from the beginning. Different colors for different players. You can see the full draft boards. You can sort by teams. Like Sleeper is my favorite. The flexibility. You want to do a fab league. You want to do a standard league. Things that these features are getting added to every day. But I think Sleeper does the best. The players, the trending page. Sleeper for me is my favorite platform. Now, if you're in a home league that's been around longer than Sleeper has been a main fantasy app, like we have, like with NFL.com, I don't think it's so much better than NFL that you need to go change your league. I will say I don't know for all the leagues off the top of my head, but I do think NFL.com does have one of the later stat correction dates. They're pretty good. They're pretty accurate. Um, they only make a handful
Yeah,
of
stat
stat
corrections
corrections,
have very rarely
and it's
in
normally a stat
NFL.com.
correction when like the fourth string tight end that got activated caught a touchdown that wasn't on the platform. Like
Yes.
But in the rare instances where stat changes have become an issue, NFL.com is the I believe the latest in getting those updated on the site. So that's my only criticism with NFL.com. But at the end of the day, it still would be number 2 on my list, followed by Yahoo and then ESPN. Honestly, give me any other. Get ESPN, and I love ESPN. Shout out to Sam who works at ESPN. Uh, Friends that work there, like great company from for a sports fan, but their fantasy app is definitely not the best.
Yeah, and I just want to hit a quick talk about Yahoo before we move on, because you talked about ESPN trying to make that fantasy hub where they have like all of their different fantasy games in one spot. Yahoo does the same thing. I play plenty of fantasy baseball, and there's not as many platforms for fantasy baseball as there is for football. So Yahoo is kind of the go-to in that. And it is a little bit annoying when it gets into the mixed baseball and football season, and you kind of have to like ignore like in your whole list of leagues, like, oh, there's a football at the top, I need to check my baseball lineups there, whatever. Like it does get a little bit crowded when both are going on at the same time. But in a way it's good at the same time, how you don't have to switch between apps. I can check my fantasy baseball lineups on a Sunday morning and then go right into checking football too. There's it's pluses and minuses to that. But I think I do still like NFL.com the best. And then it's almost a tie for me, second and third between Sleeper and Yahoo. Sleeper's coming around on me a little bit now that I've used it more, and then ESPN at the bottom.
Yeah, and I do want to, again, Sleeper is not a sponsor, but I would love if they were. But what I do like, and I think a lot of apps have started copying some of their things, but I think Sleeper does a fantastic job with league communication. It has a group chat built into your league for the entire league. It has a messages panel where you can individually message each individual player on your team. You don't have to go to your phone. You don't have to go. You can send trades through the messaging thing is how it send trades. You can see all the trade offers. It helps keep all your fantasy content in one place. You're not having to go to a Facebook message group. You're not having to go to a group chat. You're not going to have to go to your contacts and find the guy's name that you just put in your phone, Mike, and you can't remember which Mike it is in your phone because he gave your number 2 years ago trying to make a trade. Like it's all the fantasy communication, and like I said, Yahoo is doing a pretty good job. Does a decent job of that. NFL is starting to add that, but I do think Sleeper is the king, especially if you're in a league that isn't people. Like I used to be in a league for the Adam Lefko podcast formerly known as Sims and Lefko. Like they did a big fantasy league that was essentially like 30 leagues together. They all played, and then at the end of the last week of the season, all the champions played for. It was like a big championship bowl. I had people in Canada, people in Florida, and like we could all communicate that way. Didn't have to exchange any information. So I do think if you're not in a home league and you're just trying to find out, I think Sleeper is a great way to help build that fantasy communication. And I will say, if you are looking for people, you can always message us. And there is a fantasy or Couch GMs fantasy football community Facebook page. You can go at like and say, hey, I'm looking for someone and we can help out. Or if someone in there be like, hey, we need an extra person for our league. So that's a great resource for you too.
Definitely go join that group on Facebook. We can leave a link on our Facebook page here for this week. Yeah, I think that pretty much wraps up our talk on fantasy platforms. Thank you for the question, Colin. If anyone else has any questions, please drop them into our DMs, post as a comment under this video, whatever you have to do. And if you have any other questions about platforms, also, we're welcome to, please ask. We're happy to answer it. But Cody, I think we're time to talk some more training camp. Why don't we give our little training camp preview? And when we're talking training camp, we're going to break this into two categories. We have players on a budget coming up in a little bit, but we're going to start off with some top 5 position battles for fantasy. I can just throw us right in here to number 5, and I feel like I kind of convinced you and the boys to put this on the rundown. Seahawks quarterbacks, we have Drew Lock versus Geno Smith to start this off. I mean, we talked about the potential of Jimmy Garoppolo going there. That's all just speculation. There hasn't been any talk of that happening. If you listened in during our wide receiver ranking show, you know I'm a big fan of Drew Lock winning that job. I think he would be the best potential spot fill fantasy quarterback, but even more so, the best chance to get people like DK Metcalf into a fantasy relevant position for the season. Noah Fant's also another person who got traded there with Drew Lock this year that I think it'd be good to have those two who have rapport being on the field again, even though it's in a different system. I hope Drew Lock wins this job because I haven't seen a lot out of Geno Smith, but what do you think, Cody?
Yeah, I think I think when we're looking at these, we'll talk a little bit who we think is going to win it, but who would be the bigger impact for fantasy. And I think starting at number 5, the answers are different. I do think
Okay.
Geno Smith is going to win the job. The coaching, Pete Carroll loves him. He didn't look terrible. I know that's like not a great way to like hype up your quarterback going. He didn't look terrible in, filling in for Russell Wilson last year, and he was serviceable. And I think they're going to give him every opportunity to win the job. Not saying they don't like Drew Lock at all. I'm not saying they won't switch quarterbacks. They might go back and forth. I don't think either guy is locked into all 17 games starting in week 1. But I do think Geno Smith gets the start coming out of training camp. With that said, if I was drafting Seattle Seahawks players in terms of position battles for fantasy, I would hope it's Drew Lock because to me, he feels more like the gunslinger. He feels like the guy that's going to push the ball down the field. He's going to throw his interceptions. Like, I understand that. Like, I'm not picking Drew Lock as my fantasy quarterback, but it gets me more excited about the pieces around him, whether that would be DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, Noah Fant, D. Eskridge, if you want to go for a deep cut and you're in one of those 20-man leagues. Like, those would be the guys I would get more excited about if it was Drew Lock, just because I think he's more high variance. He can push the ball down the field, where in a way, like Geno Smith seems more like a Taylor Heineke. Like, not that's a terrible example, I think, but more like a game manager. Teddy Bridgewater, I think, would be a good example for Geno Smith. That, a guy that will have a game or two where he gets some big points, but for the most part, like, his job is not to make a mistake. And I actually think Drew Lock would be a little bit more like Taylor Heineke. Some games he'll be like running around, dropping deep bombs. Then he'll have a game where he throws a couple picks. He's, 60% completion percentage, and it's not a great day. But on those good days, you want parts of Drew Lock. So that's my answer on the position battle for the Seattle Seahawks quarterback.
Yeah, I mean, I think I disagree that I think it's Geno's job, even though I keep hearing that they like him. I still think that Locke is probably I hate to say the more decorated, the more stable quarterback, because he's not really proven too much in his career, but I feel like he's proven a little bit more than Geno Smith. Maybe I'm wrong. We'll have to wait and see as this one
I
works
will
out.
say, just piggybacking on that, the only like playing devil's advocate,
Mm-hmm.
you don't trade. I I know the situation wasn't. You don't trade Russell Wilson, get a quarterback in return. That's going to be your backup. That's my only
Yeah,
reason why I'm like, hey, they're just going to let Drew Lock be the. But everything seems to be pointing to or Geno Smith, not Drew Smith. Now I just want to combine the two, and heck, that might be just as fun too for fantasy.
might be
But
a
let's
better
move.
quarterback.
It probably would be, but let's move on to number 4 on the list in the top position battles across the NFL, and that is the Steelers wide receivers. Now, on the surface, this might not even appear to be a battle for Steelers fans. When we're talking Deontay Johnson versus Chase Claypool, and if you want to go versus the field, that's fine too. But Deontay Johnson has come on very strong the last 2 seasons as a fantasy option, but that was with Ben Roethlisberger. And because of Ben Roethlisberger, and I think we can also, give an honorable mention to the quarterbacks of the Steelers, so we can hit on that too if we want. But what are your thoughts on Deontay Johnson? Like, he's a guy that's getting drafted like 4th round, and like normally last year, like you'd be excited about that, but not knowing that quarterback, is he still guaranteed all the targets? Are they going younger? Are they going? They still have Najee Harris that gets a lot of targets. Pat Fryermuth coming on. Like, is Deontay Johnson a guy you're even excited about going into fantasy?
He's a guy I'm excited about, but I'm very tempering expectations. Now, I don't think the going younger thing would hurt either Deontay Johnson or Chase Claypool. Let's just realize that these guys are both like 3 years into their career. They're both very young wide receivers still. But Deontay Johnson has had drop issues. They're going to a new quarterback. Like he might get a little bit of a downtick in targets just because they're going to focus more on the run game with Najee Harris and the field there. And he was always effective because he was getting 13, 14, 15 targets a game, even though he was only catching 7. But that's still, you can still have a solid fantasy day with 7 targets. So yeah, we don't know what this offense is going to bring to the table, which is why Deontay Johnson concerns me. Chase Claypool concerns me only slightly less because I know he's a more big play threat than Deontay Johnson, but he's also a guy who's probably more suited to less targets. Like, if you're going to look at, what they are in the form of wide receiver, Deontay Johnson's built more like a wide receiver 1, Chase Claypool more like a field stretching wide receiver 2. Um, they both obviously got a ton of targets in the past, but like I said, targets are going to be down. I still probably would be okay with drafting Deontay Johnson as the first Steelers wide receiver off the board because I think better chance of having volume. But I really don't know if I like him at that 4th round value, like you were saying he's going right now. So Chase Claypool looks a little bit more enticing at his ADP. Um, it isn't necessarily a position battle as of one of them is going to be completely irrelevant and the other one is going to be amazing, but it's more like, can Chase Claypool itch into more targets that were supposed to go to Deontay Johnson? If that's the case, Johnson might not be very relevant and Chase Claypool might be very good.
I think you made some great points. Real quick, we did mention the honorable mention of the Steelers quarterbacks. Kenny Pickett, Mitch Trubisky, who starts, and do they hold the job all season long?
I'm gonna say Trubisky starts, plays a good first half of the season, starts to stutter. The fans call for Pickett. He comes in at the end of the year.
Alrighty. I think that is some good advice. We can move on to number 3. We're going to keep it on the wide receivers. The Chiefs, former Steelers wide receiver Juju Smith-Schuster is still now there. Mecole Hardman, surprising the guy that's been forgotten. And then Marquez Valdez-Scantling, who got the 3-year contract. This one is honestly the most interesting because the number 1 target for Patrick Mahomes seems like a guy. Okay, number 1 wide receiver target, Travis Kelce is the number 1. We're getting that out of the way.
Yes.
Don't need anyone in the comments like, Travis Kelce is the number 1 target. I understand. But we're talking about wide receiver targets. Which guy wins the job, or which guy would be the best for fantasy? For me, I have him Juju MVS Mecole Hardman, but I have a feeling that might not be the same for you.
I am probably actually with you with Juju, MVS, and Mecole Hardman. But similar to what I was talking about with the Steelers wide receivers, where like I like Deontay Johnson better, but I like Chase Claypool in fantasy better because of ADP. I think the most enticing person in fantasy is Mecole Hardman because you can get him in the last round. He goes undrafted in almost every mock that I've seen so far. He's the cheapest to get, and he has just as good of a shot of being the wide receiver one as MVS and Juju Smith-Schuster. So I just like Mecole Hardman for the value. But if I had to guess, like if you were saying this guy's going to be the number one wide receiver, you have to say it right now. I'm going to put my cards on Juju because I think he not only has had the most success in the past, but he's the most built for the higher volume of targets compared to the other two.
I think that was a great point. The higher volume of targets, where MVS might be, the big play guy. He might have some big games. Wouldn't be surprised if there was multiple weeks this season where he's the top receiving option for the Chiefs. But I feel like Juju might be a little bit safer. But we're going to talk about these two in a little bit. So let's move on to number 2 in our top 5 position battles for fantasy. And just like the Chiefs, they have a big hole wide receiver. The Packers have an even bigger hole at wide receiver. And this one is even more difficult for me. Is it going to be Sammy Watkins? Is it going to be Alan Lazard? Is it going to be one of the rookies in Romeo Doubs or Christian Watson or Randall Cobb, the old vet, not the old, but the veteran in the room that people often forget about, Aaron Rodgers' best friend? I'm the Packers fan. So, George, I want to hear your thoughts before I probably talk a little too long.
This answer could change as the season gets closer as well, because we did just talk about earlier in the show how Sammy Watkins is on the non-football injury list and Christian Watson is on the physical unable to perform list. So, I mean, if one of those guys ends up staying on those lists into the regular season, that obviously knocks him out of contention. I have to say that my favorite to win this is Alan Lazard. And I think that most fantasy rankings and most professionals seem to be leaning that direction because we know he already has a rapport with Aaron Rodgers. He was already semi-fantasy relevant at times last year. And now with all these targets opened up in that offense, he can really have a chance to solidify himself as a wide receiver one. Most of the reason that I'm not on the rookies like the Christian Watsons is sometimes the wide receiver position is very hard to actually acclimate to in the NFL. They might get off to a slow start. Maybe by the end of the year, they might be the leaders in the clubhouse, but I don't think at the beginning of the year it's going to be the case. And I just hate the inconsistency out of Sammy Watkins. Seems like everywhere he goes, man can have a huge 35-point game in week 1 and in week 4, but in weeks 2 and 3, he scored 2 points and 1 point. Like, I just don't like him as a fantasy player because of the inconsistency in his game, but he might be a really good player in the scope of playing wide receiver for the Packers.
I think that's a great point. And I will say in my, analysis, I think Alan Lazard is the safest. I think he has a lower ceiling. Like, honestly, I think best case scenario for Alan Lazard is like 75 receptions, 800 yards, and I'll say 8 touchdowns. I'll be a little generous on the touchdown. But like, that's a really good fantasy season. Like, you'll be happy with that, especially where he's being drafted. Now, that's the best case scenario. Where a guy like Sammy Watkins, who is being drafting later, like, if the Packers are going to have a 1,000-yard receiver, I honestly think it's going to be Sammy Watkins. Now, that's a big caveat if he can stay healthy, and we've already seen he's starting off on NFI. So there's not a lot of confidence in that situation at all for me. Randall Cobb, I think he's like the third down security blanket, very much like end of career Julian Edelman, like not a guy you can rely on in fantasy, but like in terms of football production on the field, you're really going to like Randall Cobb. The rookies for me, Christian Watson should be off PUP soon. I love him in Dynasty. Draft him in our Dynasty League that I mentioned earlier. But not drafting him unless I'm like in best ball and you're like round 20. But the rookie to keep an eye on is Romeo Doubs. I think even though he was a 4th round pick compared to a 2nd round pick, I think he had a little bit more polish to his game where Watson was full on upside. Didn't have as many route opportunities just because the school he came from and all that minutia. But this year, like if you're in best ball, like leave your draft with Romeo Doubs. I think he has potential to be a surprising candidate. Yes, he was a 4th-round pick, but so was Amon-Ra St. Brown, and we saw how much he had at the end of the season. And another guy that Amon-Ra St. Brown was, a guy that people were excited about with, a rookie, even though he was a 4th-round pick. Romeo Doubs could have similar production, especially near the end of the season. So maybe not a guy you're drafting in your redraft leagues, but if you're playing best ball, he's definitely the Packers wide receiver that I'd want to own.
Very interesting name to throw out there, Cody. I like the insight. Before we get to our number 1 position battle for fantasy, I want to throw out the other 2 honorable mentions. We already mentioned the Steelers quarterbacks, but the Jets running backs on there, Breece Hall versus Michael Carter. I don't think it makes the top 5 because Breece Hall is the expected starter, but it's interesting to see how
Agreed.
much of the pie Michael Carter is going to get. And then the Seahawks running backs, we now had Chris Carson drop off, but Rashad Penny and Kenneth Walker. Honestly, it is kind of a coin flip between the two. Walker probably could be a more skilled option, but Penny was a 1st-round pick when they drafted him, so could go either way there. We have to keep an eye on that one. But there is one more running back battle that heads off is the leader, number 1 in our position battles for fantasy. Bills running backs, Devin Singletary versus James Cook. I guess you also put versus Zach Moss because he could probably get some carries, even though he's probably not going to be the lead back.
We'll leave him off.
But it's Singletary versus
No
Cook.
offense, Zach Moss.
No offense to Zach Moss, but it's Singletary versus Cook. Singletary really came on at the end of the year last year. James Cook, me personally, I like him as a really good pass catching option in a pass happy offense. Cody, I'll let you lead it off. Who do you got?
All right, so James Cook is definitely a guy for like dynasty leagues that you have to be on the lookout for. But in redrafts, like I think we're sleeping on Devin Singletary. I think we hammered for a running back so much, like we were praying that they took Breece Hall. Like we wanted them to take Breece Hall so bad, and they didn't, which is fair. They didn't have to. They don't have to listen to the fans or us or any of the talking head media. Because I think they do like Devin Singletary, and he started to, once he was like given the role, there wasn't the whole Zach Moss some weeks, him some weeks. He started to produce. So I think with that said, I think they're going to bring James Cook on slowly. I do think he'll get more and more active as the season progresses. But especially to start the season, if you go no running back strategy and you're looking for, your 3rd or 4th running back, late in the draft, Devin Singletary will still be there, and he's still projected to be a starter. So I do think that is some value you can add at the end of your draft. And I think he'll at least be productive all season long. I see this very similar to last year. Maybe not exactly a 50-50 split, but Devin Singletary, James Cook, last year's Melvin Gordon, Javonte Williams. Like Melvin Gordon started off as the main guy. They started to get Williams more involved. They're both solid fantasy options. And at the end of the season, they are pretty much is about a 50-50 you can get. Might not get quite to 50-50 because I don't know if James Cook will be as much used in the running game, and they just don't have that many rushing attempt opportunities. But I see that as a very similar comp heading into this year with the Bills backfield.
I mean, I seem to be the host that has the hot takes on the running backs this year. Normally Tyler's the hot takes guy, but I'm someone who's leaning James Robinson over Travis Etienne. I'm still very slightly liking James Cook better than Devin Singletary. No, I do think you're right where Singletary is probably going to be the leader in the clubhouse to start the season. He might even stay there the entire year, but it's an offense that just doesn't run the ball. If they have 15 rushing attempts in a game, you could be like, that was a typical Bills game. And there's a good chance Devin Singletary could be relevant in those 15 carries. Or if they get up so big they decide to run it 25 times that game, sure, there you go. Devin Singletary is going to have a great week. But if they're in a close game, he's not the greatest pass catching back. Yeah, maybe he'll still be on the field sometimes as a pass blocker, but I think there's a niche for James Cook to be able to take over as a 3rd down back, as a guy to be used in a close game in the passing game. So that's something that we never saw the Bills have in the past, and I'm very intrigued to how they're going to use it. It's a very high risk to go out there and be like, I'm going to take James Cook. Well, maybe not high risk in a redraft. You're going to take him like the last round and trying to say like, I'm going to hope and I can drop him if it doesn't work. But it's a toy the Bills have not had in their playbook for the last how many years since they've been relevant. If they find a good way to use it, I think James Cook's the guy that'll fit that role a lot better than Devin Singletary, and there's a chance he could light up the scoreboard a little more than we're expecting.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to, just disagree a little bit with you on that one, which is all good. That's why we like to give, differing opinions so you can take what we're both saying and form your owns. But I do think Devin Singletary also will be the leader in like red zone attempts for running back. Now I do think Josh Allen will steal a few of those too. But in terms of
Zach Moss
fantasy,
might steal a couple too, just
you
because we're
can't
going to get angry about it.
probably. But I do think you have to, take into account rushing touchdowns and how important they are to fantasy and running back stats too. So that's why I'm leaning Devin Singletary. But George, we're about done with this episode. But I did want to go through a quick segment. It's called Players on a Budget. As best ball leagues already started, you've probably already done a few of those. Redraft is picking up. I know leagues are starting to draft really soon as we approach August. Just talk about some guys on the same team whose ADP gap might be a little bit more significant than their actual value gap. If you're new to fantasy football, ADP just stands for average draft position. So we got a couple guys here we can talk about. First up, real quick, Jamar Chase, projected first round pick, maybe the second round if you're in a smaller league. Average going at the 9 spot, so you pretty much have to be at an 8-team league, maybe get him the second and 10-man league. Versus T. Higgins, who is all the way down in, around the 30-31. So two and a half, 3 rounds later for a guy that honestly, I'm not saying it's, a high chance, but at the end of the season, if T. Higgins was the high performing or the number one wide receiver in Cincinnati, I wouldn't be surprised. And that's coming from like probably the biggest Jamar Chase fan, not also a Cincinnati Bengals fan.
I feel like this gap is actually pretty it's pretty good judge of how they should be this season. I don't really hate where either of them are going. And I think that's also because I'm the person who's like, did Tyler Boyd just fall off the face of the earth? Like, he's still going to get some plays. And I think that that's a better chance of inching into T. Higgins value, maybe this week, that week, that week, as compared to Jamar Chase, who I think is going to be a very consistent fantasy option this year. So just because of the chance that, oh, Tyler Boyd has a chance to be T. Higgins this week, I don't think he should be any closer. I think Chase is good where he's at, and I think Higgins is good where he's at. If you're going to be someone who wants to draft conservatively and take those 2 early running backs, T. Higgins is a great option to be your wide receiver 1/wide receiver 2. But I don't see anything changing here. I think this is just actually a good one.
I'm with you. And then also, if you're listening and you've made it through this whole show in your life, and first of all, thank you. But why are we even talking about this? Last year, we did the same thing. And some guys that last year that surprised got drafted later than their counterparts. Robert Woods was going ahead of Cooper Kupp last year. Brandon Ayuk was going above Deebo Samuel. Now, obviously, those are 2 extremes, but that's why, you have to look at these teams, where they're going, and think, wow, I might get more value if I take someone else and come back around in 2 or 3 rounds and get the next player. So I'm going to talk about the 2 wide receivers on George's favorite team, Keenan Allen and Mike Williams. Keenan Allen going around 28. That's his 28 and a half is his ADP. And Mike Williams all the way down at 49, almost 50. So almost double, or double's not the right word, but I'm trying to say in terms of ADP value. And this might be my hot take. George is the running back hot takes. I'm the wide receiver hot takes. I think Mike Williams will have a better season in terms of fantasy than Keenan Allen. I think he'll have more touchdowns. He probably won't have more catches, but I think he'll have more touchdowns. They'll be pretty close in yards, might even lead in yards. He's a young guy. They just gave him a new 3-year extension. Really good quarterback. Don't get me wrong, I love Keenan Allen. Not as much as George, but I love Keenan Allen. But I think Mike Williams will be the better 49ers guy. And getting him, at pick 50 seems like incredible value to me, especially if I have him rated above a guy that is going, pick 28.
All right. How to build your team 101. If you're looking for a wide receiver 1 going into the end of round 3, Keenan Allen's probably your better pick. That's about where he's going. He's averaged 28 and a half in this ADP. Mike Williams all the way down at 49.4. So basically the end of round 5. I think that's a little low. I like Mike Williams, not as much as Cody. I think Keenan Allen's going to be the better guy overall, but I think last year where they finished almost identical in points scored and points per week, that could be replicated. So, but he's the more inconsistent player. So if you're looking for that wide receiver one in that part of the draft, yeah, Keenan Allen's a great pick. If you have two wide receivers on your roster and you're looking for that game-changing flex, Mike Williams is the guy. And I wouldn't mind drafting him closer to being around 5, maybe inching to the end of round 4. I think his after draft position is a little bit low, but shouldn't be as high as Keenan Allen. I'm with Cody that it's a great steal, just not as great of a steal as he's making it sound.
Yeah, and I think you made a good point. Like, if you need a wide, like if you go running back, and Keenan Allen's there, like that's a great pick. But if you go hero running back, where you take, a top running back and then you go wide receiver, even if you go wide receiver and go a little bit higher than his ADP and you have him as your third option, flex option, like I love that team build. And that's what makes fantasy football so fun is what is the best possible outcome you can make for your team. A few more real quick. We don't have to spend as much time on these guys. Juju and MVS, we talked about them a little bit earlier. Juju is at 77 and MVS is at 144. So another really low guy. Like we're talking late round flyer range for MVS for a potential number one candidate for Patrick Mahomes. So I think the value supersedes anyone there. You could throw McCole Hardman in there. He's even lower than MVS, but that same value. But we talked about those guys enough. Travis Etienne versus James Robinson. Now this one is a little, not as accurate because we talked about this either. James Robinson's coming back, so he's going to shoot up draft board. So this number is quite accurate when he's currently going at 126. But Travis Etienne is going at 44. Now, I will say, if you're in a redraft league and you are drafting right now or this weekend, it is going to take some time for James Robinson's ADP to go up. So if you're like George and you're like, I think he's going to be the starter, you don't have to follow your league or your platform's rankings. If you like a guy, you want to scroll down and pick him up, play the game, know your league. If you're in a league with a bunch of Jags fans, wow, I can't believe you found that many. But 2, I'm sorry, that was so mean.
Our viewership in Florida has just hit an all-time low. Now that you said that,
know your league. If you're now, especially if you're in a league where unfortunately there's a lot of auto picks. One, get yourself out of that league, find a better league. But know that the system's ADP. Know when you have to take a guy, but don't be afraid to reach on a guy that you're really confident about, whether it's a guy coming off injury or not. If you really like Allen Lazard and you're not in a league with a bunch of Packers fans and you're like, he's going to be the guy, take him 2 rounds earlier than he's going. Because he's going so late that those rounds are important, but those are the rounds you have more flexibility. So James Robinson is going to shoot up, but you might have to scroll down if you're drafting this week or coming up this weekend. But the last one we do have to talk about, DK Metcalf versus Tyler Lockett. Another big gap. DK's at 44, Tyler Lockett's at 77. And maybe it's the quarterbacks. They're not. One, DK Metcalf pretty much at Mike Williams is crazy for where he's initially going because, they're talking about him becoming one of the highest paid wide receivers. And that's all quarterback release. But I think people are sleeping on how good Tyler Lockett is and how much of an impact he's going to be on fantasy. And I know George hates him because he drafts him all the time. He doesn't do well. He's very inconsistent. Don't shake your head. You literally drafted him last year because I said that. But Tyler Lockett is a name that if you go running back heavy, you're looking for a flex option. Like Tyler Lockett is still a good player in the NFL, and getting him around pick 80 seems like incredible value.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm still kind of waiting to see how that quarterback battle shakes out. So if you have a draft that's later in the offseason, hopefully we'll hear after preseason week 3 if it's Drew Lock or if it's Geno Smith. If it's Geno Smith, I'm kind of dropping Lockett even further. I just don't like it. If it's Drew Lock, I think that's the best chance for Tyler Lockett to have a good fantasy season because he is the downfield threat as opposed to DK Metcalf, who can kind of do a little bit of everything. So maybe I'd move him up a little bit, or at that spot, I think he's very comparable to Juju Smith-Schuster, who we just mentioned. Almost the exact same draft position. I like him better than Juju because he's on a less crowded offense and you kind of understand where he's coming from a little bit more. but I don't want to move him up the board too much. I think this is more of an option of, instead of Lockett being a better value than DK is just a value because, like you said, a number one wide receiver to go at 44th pick, despite the quarterback, he'll probably still be pretty good. That could be a steal right there.
Yeah, that's a great point on what you're saying. Just for a little clarification, looking at current ADPs, Tyler Lockett, the wide receiver currently going right ahead of him is Devontae Smith. Very similar, solid number 2 option, but who's the quarterback? And then right after him is wide receiver wise is Rashad Bateman. So potential number 1 for a team that you don't like. So very consistent on the type of player that you want. And then if I look at Metcalf, real quick, I'll pull his ADP up for you. This is me stalling as I'm talking. Terry McLaurin is going right above him, very similar in that situation. And then Michael Pittman is going right after him, and DJ Moore right after that. So those are 2 guys I'd actually like a little bit more than
I think so.
DK Metcalf and his current ADP. But after those guys, it gets a little sketchy. So some names to keep an eye on, but don't sleep on Tyler Lockett. Don't sleep on some of these guys, and always make sure you scroll down past the top 5 players that are available when you're drafting. It can really make a difference when you see a guy that you wanted, but you just didn't scroll down far enough to see him. It's okay. You don't have to draft who the NFL.com or Yahoo says might be the number 1 or best available at the current moment.
I just want to hit, could you mention, like, that is, I think, the biggest takeaway from this, like the James Robinson thing too, how you mentioned like his ADP is going to go up, but it's going to take a little bit. I just want to compare it to when we heard J.K. Dobbins tore his knee up last year and Gus Edwards was the number 1 back. I had a draft that happened in that little dead zone in that 1 week between the 2 injuries for both of them. So it obviously didn't work out in the long run, but Gus Edwards was going basically last round as like a handcuff. He moved up and he probably should have been like a 4th, 5th round running back. He went in round 9 in that draft because people didn't see him on the draft board. So always do your research, be prepared before your draft. And whether it's making your own rankings, going onto the couchgms.com, checking out our rankings, we're going to update them as quick as we hear news. So feel free to go in there. It'll probably look different than your draft. People might question what you're doing, but you're going to have to be smarter than the draft board on your draft software in order to go out there and win your league.
That's some great advice, George. And I think that's a great point to wrap it up. So as always, thanks for checking out another episode of the Couch GMs podcast. Celebrate, rejoice. Football is back. There's a lot of great content coming around the corner. And as always, this podcast is more fun for you and more fun for us when you get involved. So share us your drafts. Reach out and ask questions. We love to debate things on the show. We answered Colin right away and we said, hey, we're going to talk about this on the show. Thanks for the idea. So if you have an idea, you just want to hear us talk about something. I'm assuming
Cody's done talking, but I'm going to say it anyway.
I wasn't, but go ahead.
Yes, Cody, thank you all one more time for listening into the Couch GMs podcast. For Cody Roadcap, I'm George Kerth, and we'll see you all next week.